Monster House presents.
It's actually quite unlike anything we've ever seen before.
A giant, hairy creature, part ape, part man.
In Loch Ness, a 24-mile-long bottomless lake in the Highlands of Scotland. It's a creature known as the Loch Ness Monster.
Monster Talk.
Welcome to Monster Talk, the science show about monsters. I'm Blake Smith.
And I'm Karen Stolzno.
Hey there, Monster Talkers. It's my birthday today, October the 13th, so I'm anxious to get back to celebrating, but I wanted to get out another episode for our vampire series for October 2024. Here, you're about to enjoy a conversation with friend of the show, Dr. Brian Sharpless, author of the book, Monsters on the Couch. I don't want to spoil any of our wide-ranging conversation, but I'm going to throw a little bit of food for thought out here rather than record it as an insert. During our discussion, we talk a little bit about Vlad Tepes, known as Vlad the Impaler, who is famously tied to the story of Dracula because Bram Stoker is said to have read his story while researching his novel. One question we talk about is, what was the actual scale of his violence against the Turks who were invading Romania? He's called the Impaler for a reason, but what is the scale of it? History can be challenging to navigate because there are stories and written accounts. But then one may also ask, are these stories true? What physical evidence do we have to support the vastness of Vlad's impaling? It's a topic I want to do more research on, but I think it's pretty safe to say he did do much violence against the Turks, yet he was clearly also performing a kind of psychological warfare. The dates on this are very interesting. In our episode, the phrase Machiavellian is mentioned. Let's look at this. In 1462, Vlad wrote a letter to his king stating in part, I have killed peasants, men and women, old and young, who lived at Oblikietza and Novoselo, where the Danube flows into the sea. We killed 23,884 Turks, without counting those whom we burned in homes, or the Turks whose heads were cut off by our soldiers. Thus, Your Highness, you must know that I have broken the peace with the Sultan. So even if Vlad was exaggerating to impress his king, he killed a lot of people. Movies, of course, show vast landscapes of impaled victims, and even near that time there were woodcuts and documents showing such things. This has nothing to do with vampires, but is a brutal and bloody testament to the role of violence in politics. When you kill tens of thousands of people, your name tends to be remembered, and you're going to show up in legends. Now, this was 1462, just 3 decades before Columbus's visit to the New World, and 70 years before Machiavelli's The Prince was published in 1532. I want to know more about what we know about Vlad's true footprint on history. And he's one of those figures whose story straddles history, folklore, and fiction, so we will be getting back to him. But for now, let's get on to Brian Sharpless and some more vampire
Monster Talk.
First of all, thanks for coming back to talk to us again. And here's another plug for Monsters on the Couch, which is your book about the real psychological disorders behind our favorite horror movies. Such a fun book, great quality, good writing, and very informative. And I was just telling Karen, I would have killed to have this book when I was a teenager. This is right up my alley. I mean, it's good now, but I mean, if I could just gift myself this in the past, it would be fantastic. So, yeah.
Yeah, it would have been even better if I could have written it back then.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very impressive. But yeah, so we're continuing in the vein.
Nice.
The fun of talking about vampires. So we're having a vampirific Halloween this year, lots of vampires. So we wanted to bring you back on the show because your book is just the gift that keeps on giving, and you have a whole chapter on vampires. And then now the fact that you're in Slovenia, you went to Croatia this morning, we want to hear about your dark tourism. And you've actually gone to Eastern Europe on a number of visits, haven't you? And looked into Elizabeth Bathory and Vlad Dracula and all these different... Yeah, Balkan vampires or alleged vampires. So yeah, we've got lots to tackle today. Can you maybe tell us a bit about your trek this morning, your adventure to Croatia and to a cemetery?
Yesterday, not today, but
Oh,
So today I went to
that's a
the
time zone
the
thing then.
Neanderthal
Time
Museum.
zone.
Yeah, I went to the Neanderthal Museum, which was pretty incredible today.
Oh, okay.
I didn't know they were that
So, yeah.
sophisticated. Was it built of rocks and sticks?
Absolutely. You should have seen the gift shop. It was just flake flint everywhere. Yeah.
I paid for everything with leaves. What?
Well, then yesterday's adventure.
Yeah. So, I was in Kringa, Croatia. So this is the town where the very first recorded vampire that was sort of unearthed and killed took place. So it's the home of Yuri Grando, which Grando's not his last name. He was a big guy, and I guess they didn't have ironic nicknames back then. But he was born all the way back in 1578, and they say he died for the first time in 1656. So that would have made him 78, which isn't bad for the 17th century. But and there's different variations of the legend, as all these things. All these things have different variations. But some people say he wasn't buried properly. So at the time, you were supposed to pierce everybody's tongue before you buried them with a nail. But I guess that didn't happen. Mm-hmm. So shortly after he died, something in Kringa started knocking on doors. And if you were one of those unlucky ones that had their door knocked on, somebody from your house would die within a very short period of time. So that was going on. So random people were kind of dying in the town. And then he was also supposedly visiting his wife, Ivana, quite often. And he was continuing their marital relations against her will. So this went on for 16 years, supposedly, that he was killing people in the town and also doing this. And he was described as really scary. So he always was smiling. He had a permanent smile. But along with that, it sounded like he was always gasping for air.
Yeah. 16 years. That must have seemed like a nocturnity.
It's going to be a long fucking night, isn't it? I'm doing this on vacation. Come on.
That's why you needed to be fortified by the
That's
wine.
That's right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I imagine seeing a permanently smiling vampire just gasping.
Yeah.
Very, very tiny town. So anyway, there's this father named Father Giorgio. And he apparently, after 16 years, decided now's the time to confront him. So he made the sign of the cross and said some angry words at him, and he scared poor Yuri. And Yuri scampered off back to the graveyard. So then old Father Giorgio got a posse together, and they went to Yuri's grave, and they brought their stakes. And they were smart. They didn't use IKEA legs. They brought hawthorn stakes. That's probably the second best wood to make stakes out of. Aspen's the best because it was the wood that Christ was crucified on. That was always thought to be the most powerful.
Wow.
But so they opened up the grave and pitch black, and they tried to pound the stake into his chest, but it kept bouncing off. They couldn't get it through. So they left. They came back a few nights later, and they tried again with that hawthorn stake. It would not pierce through his heart. So Giorgio did an exorcism, and this guy named Stepan Milisek got an axe and decapitated the vampire. And that worked. So Yuri supposedly screamed, blood spurted everywhere, as you always hear in those tales. And now he was finally at peace.
Wow.
So that's the story of Yuri Grando. And the town used to have a bit more sort of what do you call it? They're just not very good at marketing, I don't think, unfortunately. They used to have a vampire cafe, but they don't have, there are very few things. There's one plaque in the town that talks about it. And you can go to the graveyard, and supposedly Yuri was buried under the walkway to the graveyard. So I got some nice pictures of that. And it was pouring down rain, broken umbrella, trying to get pictures. So. But it was worth it. It was worth it. It was good story.
That sounds like a lot of fun. And I have heard a variation on that story. And I wonder, Brian, if you heard this too, that it wasn't actually Yuri that was visiting his wife for 16 years.
I did hear somewhere else that it was a woman who was having an affair with her husband, and they both killed the guy and blamed it on another vampire. Was that the story?
Yeah, I've heard that. The different variations that, she was basically having an affair and covering it up, which we suspect took place a lot with a lot of stories of demons and, people being visited by all kinds of creatures, succubi, incubi, that it was people having affairs, cheating.
Yeah.
Well, they didn't have TV or streaming, so there was entertainment was hard to come by,
Yeah, especially in small towns.
To do what you could.
17th century.
Yeah. Well, it's so interesting that this story of Ure Grando predates some of the other vampires that Blake and I've been talking about, like Arnold Paul and Peter Blagojevich.
Yeah.
And it's just interesting that there's probably a break of 100 years or more in between those stories. But just how many stories have come out of that area and influenced the evolution of vampires over time.
Absolutely. Yeah. Slovenia, it seems to be very famous if you look in their history for having vampire hunters. So they have this vampire hunter called a Kresnik. And you could tell a kid was going to be a Kresnik if it was born with a clear or white caul over its face. So the caul is the inner fetal membrane, and kids can be born with that sometimes. So if you were clear or white, you'd be born a Kresnik. If you were born with a red caul, you'd be born a Kudlak, which was a variation of a vampire that didn't suck blood, but sucked energy, essentially.
Oh, yeah. So that idea is pretty old, too, the energy vampire. Yeah.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
That's fascinating. In modern sort of vampire culture, you sort of get this split between the psychic vampires and the sanguinarians.
Yes.
And it's, by the way, your chapter is really cool in that you don't just talk about classic movie vampires, but you also talk about historical cases and sort of the pathologies that sort of correspond with those. Sometimes a pathology might be a pre-existing condition that gets tied to folklore, but here, like with Renfield syndrome, which I found really interesting, that's pulling the title straight out of the book. And I guess I'm wondering to what extent are the people who suffer from, I guess we should talk about what it is, but what my real question is, to what extent did Renfield syndrome, do we think, is it derivative from Dracula in particular, or is it, I guess I'm curious about how much the book itself is infecting people's behavior.
Yeah, it's a great question. So Renfield syndrome, aka clinical vampirism, is a desire to drink human blood. So that's one of the key points. It has to be human blood, and it is not intended to fulfill sort of a nutritional need. So people that have Renfield syndrome, they drink blood. It's associated with sexual arousal. When people drink it, they can sometimes talk about feeling very powerful, a oneness with the universe, what Freud would call the oceanic feeling, but it would elicit other psychological effects beyond nutrition. And so along with that, it would also have to cause clinically significant distress, meaning it's bothering you, you're worried about this, the implications of it, or it interferes with your life in some way, so you can't fulfill certain roles. And I guess one of those roles would be staying out of jail.
Yeah.
Well, so there are consensual vampires.
That's what I was going to say. Is there's what makes it a pathology is whether it's wanted or not. Is that? Yep.
Yeah, if it's troublesome or causes interference or it sort of violates informed consent rules.
Yeah,
yeah. We all most of us like to keep our blood inside our bodies.
Yeah, I know, I do. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, so we spoke with Professor Nick Groom recently about his book, and we were getting into the kind of etymology of the term vampire and the metaphorical associations that were common at the time, talking about vampires as politicians as vampires and nobility, members of the aristocracy as vampires. And you talk in your book a bit about BPD and personality disorders and vampirism. What's the link there? What kinds of symptoms and behaviors do people with personality disorders display that are kind of associated with vampirism?
Yeah, well, certainly some of the serial killer vampires would have had antisocial personality disorder.
Right.
But one of the interesting things in the few, I mean, there aren't really large studies of vampires in a psychological or psychiatric literature, but we do have a bunch of case studies. And one of the interesting commonalities across the case studies is that people with clinical vampirism don't seem to have a coherent sense of identity. And so that's one of the overlaps with cluster B personality disorders. So people with borderline or narcissistic personality disorders, if you try to get them to describe themselves, they have a really difficult time doing so. And so that's one of the overlaps. And in terms of, there's for some reason lots of jokes about vampires and narcissists. You can find lots of variations of that. One of them that comes to mind is, why don't vampires attack narcissists? Professional courtesy.
I like that.
So there does seem to be a link in the literature, and you hear of people sort of sucking the life out of others, narcissists sucking the life out of others. But yeah, I don't know. I treat lots of folks with BPD and narcissistic personality disorder. I like working with them.
Sure.
They both have a troubled relationship with mirrors.
Yeah, very much so. Yep.
Well, what about the flip side of this? The victims. Now, not victims who are attacked, but victims who willingly submit. That sort of person.
Yeah.
Does that fit into the DSM?
I'm sure we could make it. It would depend. Sort of. I guess we would have to tease out their motivation. So you could imagine it being done for sort of a sadomasochistic sort of reason. You could see it being done for a more dependent reason, where they feel they sort of have to capitulate to somebody else's will and do whatever they say, even if it hurts them. So I think you could fit in there. There's been very few. I'm not aware of too many case studies of sort of the other half of the vampire couple. Usually, if you look at some of the documentaries that have been made in Louisiana, especially, where they have vampire communities and sort of vampire subcultures, both the people a lot of the times will drink each other's blood in a consensual manner.
Well, and if you aware of any fatalities with this kind of thing connected to either that or people with Renfield syndrome or BPD who indulge in these pastimes?
And kill people? Sure. Yeah. Richard Trenton Chase, the vampire of Sacramento, he was a serial killer. He killed several people and drank their blood because he believed that Nazis controlled by UFOs were causing his mother to poison his soap dish. And so the poison in the soap dish was going to powderize his blood. And so he had to drink blood to make sure his own blood didn't turn to powder. So he actually paid.
Frightening.
Yeah. He actually got I can't remember who, a fairly famous physician. He got a sample of what he thought was, it was regular mac and cheese, but he thought it was a poison variation of the soap dish, and he paid him to analyze it. Or he somehow.
That is so weird.
Yeah. Yeah. It was a very elaborate delusion. He should have went into screenwriting.
You talk a lot about the sort of the different kinds of vampires, and that's something we've been sort of grappling with this month is, what is a vampire? Because you've got everything from the sort of almost a zombie revenant types, just bestially wandering around looking for victims. You've got the kind that seem to be tied to a family, that they prey on their family. You've got the kind that are all fancy and suave, Bram Stoker style. And so many of the traits change over time and largely affected by literature and film. As you pointed out really nicely, talking about how important is sunlight to a vampire. So maybe you want to unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, it really depends. I mean, if you saw the Bram Stoker's Dracula, you see Gary Oldman perambulating around London in the broad daylight. So it wasn't an issue in there. And you see lots of inconsistencies in the literature, just as you do with werewolves. Like, for instance, there's very little evidence in the historical record that silver was ever used against werewolves. I found 2 instances, and they were in the 1700s. So it wasn't a big part of the historical folklore. And yeah, the vampire that was, harassing peasants in Central and Eastern Europe would be unrecognizable by Hollywood standards. It was smelly, it was dirty, it was a peasant, it was certainly wasn't an aristocrat, it wasn't wearing fancy clothes, it was most likely wearing its burial shroud if it was wearing anything at all, and there are some reports of it eating the burial shroud as it was walking around looking for victims. And yeah, like you said, it would attack usually the people that were closest to it and would actually mourn the human side passing the most. It would visit first-degree relatives and attack them instead of, strangers in bars or back alleys in New Orleans.
Wasn't there a case in the United States that was like that?
Yeah, Mercy Brown. That was, I believe, the last. You never know with these things, especially in America these days. But that was supposedly the last person exhumed for vampirism in the U.S.
Yeah, that was. So, I think the exhumation was maybe like, let's see,
1892.
Yeah. There you go.
That's still so recent.
It's very recent. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and what they did, they exhumed Mercy's corpse because they believed she was visiting and draining her brother. And so they exhumed the corpse. It looked completely well preserved, and they ripped open the chest cavity and found liquid blood in her heart, and they took that as definitive proof that she was a vamp. And so they removed the heart, burned it, I think, on her actual gravestone. They burned it to ashes and then mixed ashes with water and made her brother drink it. And so that anti-vampire tonic was supposed to end it. But that happened in 2002 in Romania. Almost the exact same thing. They believe somebody was bothering their family members. They exhumed the corpse, burned the heart, and I think they used a pitchfork too, from what I recall. And then they forced they didn't force, but they had the relative drink the ashes mixed with water again.
Yeah.
So
that's kind of where I wanted to take this discussion. How common are these beliefs today? Because you go to some areas and they'll talk about certain monsters and cryptids, and they're really just doing it to have fun with tourists, and no one really believes in this kind of thing anymore. But how prevalent are these beliefs in Eastern Europe and the Balkans today?
Boy, I wish I had good data on that. I really don't know, but clearly with certain people, it remains, because again, that just happened within the past 2 decades in Romania.
That is recent.
And that was just a 2.5 or 3 hour drive from Bucharest.
I mean, you have to assume that folk beliefs are still widely accepted. Look at how many people in America honestly believe that there are witches and demonic influences affecting real world things, and sincerely believe it, right? It's a lot. It's a lot. It's a super disturbingly large number of people.
Yeah, just with sleep paralysis, I did a big survey with the BBC and some colleagues at Goldsmith, over 3,000 people, and 7.1% of them, I believe, did not attribute it to a natural cause. They thought it was something supernatural or something with like conspiratorial, with using energy beams or cell phones, things like that were causing the sleep paralysis.
I mean, we get a lot of email from listeners, and I think the most moving and powerful sort of communications we've received have been people who've learned about sleep paralysis through our show. And it's removed that fear of the supernatural attacking them at night. It's like, it doesn't stop the sleep paralysis, but at least they can contextualize it and know that what's happening is a natural thing and not a demonic thing. And that really helps, I think.
Yeah, it does. Absolutely. I've gotten a lot of emails with that as well. Well, the weird thing was, in that survey, we were actually calling it sleep paralysis. So the people were aware of this, and they got into the study by acknowledging so many symptoms of it. So even in spite of that, and you see this in that documentary, The Nightmare, they followed 8 people with sleep paralysis.
Yes, I haven't watched it, but I've got it. Yeah.
Yeah, you got to watch it. It's really good. But a number of the people, even though they've done lots of deep dives on the internet into the research of it, they still believe it's something supernatural. It's really interesting. It's very resistant with certain people to disabuse them of that notion that it isn't supernatural.
Yeah. Yeah, those beliefs really persist. And so we've talked about that a lot on this show, and in particular, Blake's experiences with sleep paralysis. And so I think that's why it's really attracted a lot of people Googling their symptoms and who really want to look for a natural explanation rather than those who believe in a paranormal explanation.
Yeah, I mean, I think the road to skepticism, at some point you have to take that road down, examining your own ability to perceive things and learning that perception's not that reliable. And that's a life-changing ride because, you know, we're born to believe everything we see and hear. so learning that it's not that reliable, it's a lot to process. But
you get stuff from it too. Right?
Yeah.
You get something from that belief, even if you believe you're being tortured by something supernatural, you get something from that.
Yeah, it gives you interesting stories, if nothing else. I mean, it's certainly a weird experience, you know. So whether there's a natural explanation or not, when you have shadow people appearing at your bedside or monsters and you can feel them pressing down on you, it's hard to process. Even if you know it's not real, it's very disturbing. So
absolutely.
Well,
but they're visiting you, right?
Yeah,
they're not visiting other people. So
that's true.
You, potentially a sense of purpose or
it makes
meaning.
People feel special.
Like the alien abduction beliefs, you know.
Yeah.
They're really resistant to change as well, yeah.
Yeah, I think, and just talking about personality disorders, that it gives people a sense of identity as well. This is part of who I am and what happens to me, and I'm special, point. And But you have done a lot of dark tourism over the years in the Balkans, and so we were talking about how this vampiric behavior can be dangerous with Renfield syndrome and BPD. But you just mentioned to me in private correspondence how sometimes dark tourism can be dangerous as well, how it can really turn. Do you want to tell us a little bit about some of the dangers involved in going to these places and checking out the castles and the history of Elizabeth Bathory and Vlad Tepes?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it can be physically dangerous because, one of the most shocking things for me in visiting Europe and historic sites is how very few areas are roped off and there are very few warnings.
Oh,
like
scary.
I was literally, you can easily get on parapets you shouldn't be on. You can get into caves. You can be on very dodgy stone walls, and so you have to be careful there. But the good news is you get real up close and personal with things. So I've literally been the only person in a castle before.
Wow.
And some of them they don't even have they're completely free and open to the public. So you don't have to pay a toll. They're just on the side of the road crumbling, and you go to them and
really,
yeah.
So different to the UK.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
You need what's that card you need for the UK that costs like £50?
Not sure. Yeah, but it's very expensive to go to all the places.
So if you're inside a castle and you're going up the narrow stairs and you trip and fall and suddenly yell expletives on the way down, that's Tourette syndrome, right?
Oh, wow. He was just sitting there all quiet formulating that one.
That's a good one. I'm impressed.
Oh, don't be.
But so that's how it's dangerous. But,
yeah. I was going to say, in your chapter, you do talk about Vlad and Elizabeth, and you also sort of you did a nice job of quickly summarizing why they're not really good vampire candidates. Would you want to hit that right quick?
Yeah, sure. Well, Vlad Tepes, or Vlad Dracul, Vlad II, he also known as Dracula now, he it turns out he was accused of vampirism after the fact. So he was very much a man of his time, very barbarous guy, also pretty smart. I read some of his translated letters. He was no dummy, but he engaged in psychological warfare, and he's still famous today in Romania and held as a national hero because he was key in stopping the Ottoman Turks from really further invading Christendom. And the way he did this, other than killing a lot of Turks, was capturing a lot of them and then inserting very sharpened poles into sensitive orifices and then hanging them up to slowly die very painful deaths. So he would create veritable forests of impaled Turks. And so when the next Turkish army would come by, they would see their comrades.
You don't have to build a wall if you could build a fence of your enemies, right? It's like.
Can I ask about numbers regarding that? Because I've heard some outrageous numbers that he killed maybe 40 to 50,000 people, or that he had, as you said, these forests of impaled people. I mean, where did they get the influence from? How did they do this? I'm just wondering how much of this is folklore and how much is fact.
There's contemporaneous evidence of that piece, but where it gets dodgy and where the vampiric connections come out was with Russian and German pamphlets that were very anti-Vlad, and so they described him as sitting in front of these impaled victims with warm bread and dipping his bread in the blood. And so that's
propaganda, hey?
Exactly. So fake news was alive and well back then in the 15th century.
But yeah, I do think it's interesting when you see these documentaries about people living there today and how he is framed as being he was a fair and just prince and leader, and that he did what he had to do. And I mean, to us, it's horrifying to hear about these stories to varying degrees of truth. But it seems like he is a real hero there today. Yeah,
he did have a strange sense of justice, and there are some cases in the literature of him sort of righting wrongs for other people, even peasants. And there was a famous story. This could be apocryphal, but he supposedly kept, I think, a gold chalice in the center of town, completely unguarded, when most of the population might not have even seen gold. And supposedly, because it was his, nobody touched it. So he was very much into law and order, but it was his particular law and order, and the punishments meted out were pretty extreme. But he was but you read his letters. He had kind of a practical sort of Machiavellian sort of character. Very aware guy. He wasn't just a mindless brute, but he wasn't a vampire either.
Yeah. He seems to be one of those historical figures who attracts a lot of posthumous folklore. I think the story about him holding a feast for all the iffy criminal types and then locking the doors and burning the building down. But it's a great story. But there's multiple versions of that story across Europe attached to different people. So I feel like that may be
urban legend.
That might be made up. Yeah.
And if you're wanting to do dark tourism yourself, don't go to Bran Castle. There's no evidence he even stayed there, let alone lived there. But the main castle to go to is Poinari Castle, and this is where it can get dangerous. So this is in the middle of the Carpathian Mountains on this very windy road. I'm going to butcher the pronunciation, but Transfergessen, but it's this road that winds up through the mountains, and you have to climb hundreds and hundreds of steps to get to this keep, Poinari Castle, but it's not a castle in the traditional sense, but he was documented to have been there. But there are so many bears in Romania that several tourists were actually killed going up to this place. And they had to add a big fence. When I was there, they had a fence, but they still had all these warning signs up about bears. But yeah. So you're not going to get killed by vampires, but bears. Yeah.
More than you bargained for. Yeah.
Yes.
I always think, those real, like we're talking about serial killers and bears, those are the real dangers, not the vamps.
Nope.
Well, I guess they're both following their nature, but yeah. Well, I'm not going to ask you biology questions, but I'm curious about what kind of bears those are that are eating people over there. I don't actually know. I assume that would be a European brown bear, but I don't know. I guess
I believe so.
Yeah. Several different kinds of bears out there.
Well, we do need to wrap things up pretty quickly, but I think we didn't mention, we mentioned, but didn't chat about Elizabeth Bathory. You have looked into her as well, haven't you, Brian?
Yeah, I've visited several of her castles. Yeah, she has some of my favorites. So if I could pick one castle to go see to tell your listeners, just don't go when I'm there because I like to have it by myself. But Čachtice Castle in Slovakia. It's breathtaking. It's in the Little Carpathian Mountains. This is the castle that she was imprisoned in after her trial. And she, though people dispute it, and you can make good cases for either side, she may be the most prolific serial killer of all time. So some of the estimates go up to 650, which I think is preposterous. But I would be of the opinion that in the 1 to 200 range for her. And so after her trial, which she actually wasn't on trial, it was her associates were, she was nevertheless imprisoned, but she never actually was sort of testified or used as even a witness.
Yeah.
They just convicted her and put her there. Yeah.
Well, what do you think then, if she was killing people, do you think that those stories about her bloodlust were true, or do you think that she was a sadist, or do you think these were overblown and this was propaganda?
Yeah, the bloodbaths were complete bullshit. The first report of that was in, I think, the 1720s, and she died in 1614. So there were 300 witnesses in her trial, and I've read the entire testimony. There's nothing in there about her taking baths or even putting blood on her skin on purpose. But yeah, she was, according to the trial record, she was a sexual sadist. So she liked to torture and kill young women. And it started out people that were working for her. So she started essentially a girls' school and started killing peasants in there. And then later on, she started killing some of the nobility, and that started raising more eyebrows. So, yeah.
Wow,
very interesting case. Brilliant woman. She was fluent in 5 languages when most people couldn't even write one. And by all accounts, she was a good mother, which is pretty hard to imagine if you're torturing people. And she was a patriot. She owned more land and money than the Hungarian king at the time.
Yeah, which I think
that made her dangerous.
Well, yeah, we've read. I guess we've had some previous episodes where we talked about the possibility that she was framed just to steal her stuff, and that's a real interesting. I guess I'm curious as what the forensic evidence exists that there were this many deaths in the area, or or their church records. Like with the Beast of Gévaudan, we know there are corpses, there's burials, there's church records of the deaths. It's like I don't know. I had never read any of the trial stuff, so I don't know. Is there corresponding sort of paperwork to show the vastness of her depravity? So.
There's lots of reports, but no forensic evidence. I've never heard of them sort of unearthing any bones on the site that could be directly linked to her. But you do have a lot of testimony. And like I said, you can make a case that it was a frame-up. But the interesting piece was before she was actually imprisoned, she had actually made a will and essentially ceded all of her belongings. So the crown couldn't get her land or her money. So that's
she's very clever girl. Clever girl.
Yeah.
But it does make me wonder about that trial, because not too long before that, I'm just thinking about Anne Boleyn, the second wife of Henry VIII, and how there was testimony and proof that she was a witch and that she'd slept with her brother and all of these other men and was doing all of these things. And so it's just, we've got evidence to a point, but then it's sorely lacking. But it's such an interesting story.
Quite.
Yeah, I could talk a lot about that, but I'd probably bore your listeners to death. But there's certain pieces of evidence that I like, including some private correspondence with some of the people that were like the main guy who charged her, a man by the name of Georgi Thurzo. We have his private correspondence with his wife, and they were friends. They were, when her husband, Erzsébet's husband, Ferenc, died, he essentially had his best guy say to take care of her, Georgi Thurzo. And so they were close, and he was the person who actually charged her. But you can read the back and forth. He was trying to protect her in certain ways from the crown, even back then. So it's really interesting. So if it's a frame-up, it's a very, very complicated, strange frame-up. And can I just brag about something?
Sure.
I spent a month corresponding with the Hungarian National Archives, and I was actually able to hold 3 of her letters in my hand.
Neat.
Without gloves.
Wow.
Oh, that's wonderful.
From 1608 and 1610. It was fascinating.
That is.
So cool.
I have copies of those.
Oh, that's
lovely.
really,
They still
cool.
survive. A lot of her correspondence still survives.
That's so interesting that they preserved it. I guess that's just kind of amazing, and
let people hold them.
Yeah,
I was surprised by that.
That is amazing. Well, Brian, as always, an interesting conversation, and if you like this stuff, listeners, I can't recommend Monsters on the Couch enough. Go out and get it.
Mm-hmm.
Links in the show notes. If you buy it through our show notes, we get as much as $1 if enough of you buy one.
Wow. Probably more than I get.
So I appreciate. I mean, it accumulates, but I mean, like, it's like after 5 or 6 months, it'll go. You've got your Amazon. What do they call it? Affiliate earnings. It's like it'll be like $12. I'm like, oh, thanks.
Spend it all in one place.
Well, I've been pouring it back into book purchases for the show because it costs a lot to do this research, and of course we love it when you guys, our guests, come on and have saved us the purchasing and all this footwork. But we have to do our own stuff too, and it does cost a penny. So yeah.
Insert Patreon ad here.
Exactly.
Patreon Monster Talk.
That's right.
Everybody.
But again, do check it out. Hit the show notes. And Brian, what are you working on now? What's next for Brian?
I just completed a manuscript on clinical therianthropy. So the largest collection of cases to date, and I was able to do statistical analyses on people who believe they turn themselves into animals. I might be the first person to be able to do this with my buddy Jan Dirk Blom from the Netherlands. So we got together and collaborated. We have a sample of, I think, 76 people who believe they have turned themselves into animals. And we had some very interesting findings. I would be happy to come back on and talk about all of them.
Oh, you
and
must.
Some of them, and just to wet your whistle, some of them involve bestiality.
Well, that'll give you pause.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh dear. It's time to say goodbye.
It's late in Slovenia.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much for making time for us.
Thanks for having me.
Yes,
It was a
thank
pleasure,
you. That was
two.
fantastic. Always love talking to you.
Cheers.
Monster Talk.
You've been listening to Monster Talk, the science show about monsters. I'm Blake Smith.
And I'm Karen Stolzno.
You just heard an interview with Dr. Brian Sharpless, author of the book Monsters on the Couch, discussing the intersection of psychology and vampires. Check out a link to his book and other interesting additional reading in our show notes. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Monster Talk. Our goal here is to bring you the best in monster-related content with a focus on scientific skepticism and critical thinking. If you enjoy our show and want to support our mission, start out by visiting monstertalk.org/support. That's monstertalk.org/support. There you'll find links to our Patreon page, as well as a donate button if you'd like to just make a one-time contribution. A great way to support the show is to buy books from our Amazon wish list. These are books that directly help with our monster research. We love used books very much, so don't feel compelled to buy new ones, and we're also very fond of Kindle editions because of their easily searched content. And without spending any money at all, you can support and raise the profile of the show by leaving a positive review at iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Positive reviews help keep us visible in iTunes, which is a great way to help us find new listeners. Finally, remember to share episodes you really like with your friends and family. You can help make Monster Talk the nightlight that keeps monsters away from someone you love. Monster Talk theme music is by Peach Stealing Monkeys. Hey, what kind of bread do vampires make? Rise from the grave. Oh, don't groan. It's my birthday.
This has been a Monster House presentation.